Hello and thanks for watching this Cloud9 ERP Solutions video and subscribing to our YouTube channel. In this video, we're going to talk about tenants and what tenants are and how to work with them in Acumatica. So Acumatica is different than most SaaS solutions in that you maintain your own database and tenant. Acumatica doesn't share the database with other customers. So whether you host Acumatica your own, that's an option, or whether Acumatica is in a SaaS environment where Acumatica maintains the servers and all that, either way, you can manage your tenants. So what is a tenant? A tenant is almost like a different database within your company. A tenant is a completely different set of users, transactions, chart of accounts, customers, vendors, the works. So the only thing that's really shared between the tenants is the URL. When we start to get into different URLs, we call that an instance. That's our internal tech term, different instances or different tenants. Different tenants are on the same instance. So what you can see here is a tenant list. So essentially there is only one tenant here. Acumatica has a tenant ID. The tenant ID 2 is the very first number that's used for a Acumatica installation. And you can see the tenant name and the login name. The login name is used for external applications. So for example, I am admin here. So my username is admin. But if I'm logging in remotely, maybe using an API or some software that integrates with Acumatica, my username to log in, the user credentials, would be admin@company. That's how we'd be able to find this particular tenant. That way, the technology that we're using to connect to Acumatica knows which tenant we're working with. If we wanted to insert a new tenant, we can click the button here, and Acumatica comes up with this tenant profile screen. Here, notice the next ID is number 3. We'll call this a test company. So the login name and the tenant name can be the same. A tenant name is a little bit prettier. It's the kind of thing that shows up in reports and stuff. You still have additional options to change that. But we can click Save. And notice now Acumatica's logged us out. And notice now, well, you didn't see it before, the login credential screen, I never showed it to you. But prior to this, because we only had one tenant, there was no drop down for select a tenant. Didn't make any difference. There was only one tenant. But we now have the company, we saw that before, and the test, the one we just created. There is one thing that's shared between different tenants, and that's the admin user. So if you have an admin user with a specific password and you create the next tenant from that original tenant, it will pass the admin credentials over. It does this because otherwise you'd have no way to get into the new tenant. So if we sign in, we can now see a brand new company. Brand new company that really doesn't have anything set up. There's not even any menu items here. But if we went over to our tenant list, you can see whatever screen we go to, Acumatica is going to request that we at least go through this enable feature process where we enable the features that we need. So we don't need to do much here. I'm just going to click enable. For the purposes of this discussion, we essentially just need to get to the configuration screens. And now that I did that, you notice I have some menu options here. But if we go back to the tenant list, you can see that we're currently logged into tenant number ID 3 test. And you can make changes here. If you need to, you double click on it. You can make all sorts of things here. Now, what we didn't do is, normally when I do our demos or we do our videos and stuff, we show the demo data. That's beneficial for me anyway, because there's data we can look at together to show different functionality. But when we created this tenant, of course, it was blank. There's no transactions. There's no test customers or anything like that. But notice up here, if I click on my username, you can switch to the other tenant here without signing out. Now, This is to say that you can do that. You can see the other tenants if your credentials match the other tenant, meaning the username and the password match, then you'll be able to see the different tenants up here. So again, the admin user was created as a result of the company tenant. So that got passed to the test tenant. So now that I'm in the test tenant, I can see the company tenant. So we could switch back. And if we open up this particular tenant, I want to show you a couple of things we can do. The first thing is we can create a snapshot. So creating a snapshot essentially creates a duplicate tenant of your existing site. So essentially it's a backup. So if we click create, you have a couple options here. You can give it a name. You have an export mode. So this gives you the ability to export it, but what do you want to include in it? So maybe you only want the settings. Maybe you want full or full exceptions and wikis. So you can select those options and then click OK. Now this prepare for export essentially turns it into a file that can be downloaded. So from a technical standpoint, what does that mean? Well, the database is on Microsoft SQL. In this case, it's SQL database. But when we prepare for export, Acumatica creates a file that's downloadable on the Internet Information Server, the server that Acumatica is hosted on. So if we select that, essentially whatever the size of the database is, you'll need that storage space on the web server as well. So the reason I bring that up is because it is significant. Many companies, when they set up their hosting environment, their SQL database has tons and tons of storage in terms of disk storage. But their web server might not, because Acumatica doesn't require that much storage on the web server with the application that's running. And typically you have a separate server for your application as you do your database. So whatever the size is that we're going to create here, you need to make sure that you have enough disk storage on your web server if you're preparing to export it. Depending upon the size of your database, this could take some time. Also, be sure to check with us, because if your database is too big, there are limitations to web browsers and how much data they can pass along. But having said that, notice it's ready for export. The size on the disk is shown here, 86 megs. It gives you the creation date. And you could see the export mode and all that. So the other thing we can do is we can import a snapshot. So let's say we wanted our sales demo database. We could import this. It'll ask us to do a selection from our local disk and attach it and then upload it. Once it's uploaded, you can then restore. Once you select what you want, you restore the snapshot. We'll show this in a second. The other thing you could do is you can prepare for export. So we chose the binary format. That's what I know. It's a zip file, essentially. Click on export. That'll export the file. So where do we want to save it, for example? The other option we have, if we go over here to our Ellipse, is we could copy the tenant. So we could copy this tenant to another. If you select that, it'll say, well, where do you want to copy it to? We can copy this directly to test. So essentially, we're taking our latest and greatest information from our primary tenant, number 2, company, and we're dumping it over to the test tenant. We click OK, that'll transfer it over. So that's an option there. The other thing you could do is you could change your tenant to a test. So Acumatica has licenses, and the licenses give you so many amount of working companies in the software. However, if you change to a test tenant, you can use this as a test to do some work, but you're limited to, for example, 2 users. Additionally, Acumatica has an optimized database option here. The way these tenants work is it's a simply one database with all your records separated by a tenant ID. Every once in a while, you can optimize the database and it'll clean up things, old records that you don't need anymore. But you'll get a warning message here if there's something that needs action. And lastly, you could view the space usage. That's in our space usage screen, but it shows the total amount of space by the tenants, by snapshots, and what your free space is. Free space based on license. So if we go back, just to wrap this up, and we go to our test tenant, we'll open up the profile of that tenant, and let's import that snapshot. And click upload. So now that it's done, notice we have this record here. So the snapshot is here, but we haven't changed anything with our tenant, but we have this stored. We brought it in from the other tenant. So our options are, we could also restore the snapshot. So if we click this, it'll restore and make this tenant the same thing as the other one. We could have used the copy function over here as well, but this gives you the ability, if you're getting the snapshot from an external source, then you may pick up the file and send it another way to a different instance, import it, and then restore it. Additionally, you can also see history on snapshot restoration. So you can see who did it, when they did it, and you can see what users are part of those different tenants. So the snapshots are useful. We generally use them when we're doing implementation. Anytime we want to lock in some progress, for example, we just imported customers, we'll create a snapshot before we move on to our next step. So this is very helpful if you're going to be doing something big. This is your own way of backing things up. Hopefully this gives you a better idea of what tenants really mean and what you can do with them. Thanks again for watching and subscribing to our YouTube channel. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again. Have a great day.